Oh, okay, don't worry. Thank you.
Oh, it can now record. I think it can also record now from my end. Let's change.
Just do it just in case.
Okay.
Thank you. Erica, over to you.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. Good to see you again. Today we are going to talk in more detail about AST reading exercises. I touched upon it a little bit in a previous presentation, but we will go a little bit deeper today, and we will look at examples both for disc diffusion and for broth microdilution. And you're very welcome to interrupt me and to ask questions or to post them in the chat. So I think when we have done the disc diffusion part, we can have a short break and then move forward with the broth microdilution and some recommendations and conclusions in the end. So the idea or the aim of performing a reading exercise is to harmonize reading zone diameters and broth microdilution endpoints. And that is a very important part of disc diffusion and broth microdilution testing. Of course, if we follow the instructions for everything, which we should, and still read results differently, we will get different results. And we always recommend, if you're going to perform a reading exercise, that you start with an educational section. For disc diffusion, there is quite a lot of good material on the UCAST website that you can use. You have the disc diffusion reading guide, but there is also important and good information in the disc diffusion manual and also in the instruction videos on disc diffusion, where there is a specific instruction video on reading of zones. For broth microdilution, we don't have that many extensive documents that are UCAST documents. You know that we recommend following the ISO standard for performing the method, but we have quite a lot of information in the UCAST broth microdilution reading guide, and it's a little bit more information than actual reading. So that's also very useful. And then the idea of performing a reading exercise is to train staff by reading from the same plate. And that is regardless of if it's a disc diffusion or a broth microdilution plate. So these are kind of the two steps. Education first, then reading, and then of course some evaluation and feedback to the people who participated in the reading exercise. And we will start with some examples and thoughts about reading exercises for disc diffusion. When you have a theoretical education about reading, I think it's always very important to go back a few steps in the disc diffusion method and also talk about and remind the staff about the importance of inoculating plates in a good way to achieve a good result. We should talk, so I suggest talking about inoculation of plates, examination of plates after incubation, and also the reading instructions. And as usual, you will find the materials you need if you go to AST bacteria and then disc diffusion methodology. There you have the manual. You have a slideshow with the same content as in the manual, containing the whole disc diffusion method, and then also the reading guide. The instruction videos are found in a different place on the website, videos from UCAST, and there you will be linked to YouTube where you find the English versions of these. But as you can see, there is one on reading of inhibition zone diameters. So there's specific instruction video on reading of zones. So if we do go back a little bit and look at the important parts, so inoculation of plates. When you inoculate plates, the aim should be to have a confluent growth, but they should not be over-inoculated, but also that the growth should be evenly distributed over the agar surface to make sure, or to try to get as even zone diameters as possible. And we know that streaking of plates will affect how the zone diameters appear a lot. If you streak very fast and in an irregular pattern, your zone diameters will probably not be circular, and you will have marks and stretch from the streaking that will make it more difficult to read the zones. So I would say start by going back and talk about the inoculation of plates. That you should avoid over-inoculation for gram-negative bacteria, but by removing excess fluid from the cotton swab before you streak the plates. For gram-positive bacteria, you should not remove excess fluid and take particular care to ensure that there are no gaps between streaks. And this is what we mean when we say that it's important to streak the plates carefully to get as circular zone as possible, and the growth should be evenly spread over the entire agar surface. This is a picture which is also available in the slideshow on the UCAS website. I also think it's very good to show it and go back and even more point out the importance of streaking the plates carefully. And I think in the example here for Pseudomonas aeruginosa, where you to the left have a plate with a nice evenly distributed inoculum and very clear, nice circular zone diameters, whereas on the other side here, you can see that one of the zones have a flat end here, and that is only a result of streaking the plates. So that's also one thing when you prepare a reading exercise, you can show good examples to the lab. This is how the plates should look like. You should have an even growth, evenly spread of the agar surface, and it should be confluent but not over inoculated. And then we also recommend that you go through the reading instructions, that you should have a specific light source when reading zones. So it's very good with a desk lamp that you can move yourselves and change the direction of. So the plate should be illuminated with reflected light, and we don't recommend only using the ceiling lighting. So if you have another lighting source, that's much better. You should also remind people that you should hold the plate about 30 centimeters from the eye, and you should read complete inhibition as judged by the naked eye unless otherwise stated. And when we have worked with the disk diffusion method, we have noticed more and more that if you hold the plate at a 45-degree angle to the workbench, it's usually easier to define the zone edges. You will get rid of a little bit of that hazy, thin hazy growth. That will disappear when you hold the plate in a 45-degree angle to the workbench. So that's also something that we recommend. We always recommend it for Campylobacter and anaerobic bacteria, but it's generally a very good recommendation. You should also talk about how to read plate zones from Miller-Hinton and MHF plates. And that's from Miller-Hinton plates without supplements. You read zones from the back of the plate, and it should be against a dark background. For the MHF plates, you have to remove the lid and read from the front. And for MHF, it's not specifically stated, but in our experience, it's always better to have a light background and not a dark background, because it's easier then to see the difference between growth and not growth. So this could be part of the theoretical background, and you have access to the disk diffusion reading guide, which both contains the more general reading instructions and how to handle colonies within zones if there are no specific instructions on that, how to deal with hemolysis and swarming, etc., etc. And then we also have in the end the specific reading instructions that apply to specific organism agent combinations. So it's good to go through that, and I think having a reading exercise, it's always good to just update everyone, remind everyone about the reading instructions. We know that when you do something day after day, year after year, sometimes you start to change small things. And this is a way of harmonizing the reading again and making sure that everyone follows the reading instructions. And then when you are going to set up the plates to be read, then you can have different aims. One could be, and that should be the main part in the beginning, I think, that should be to train the general reading instructions. How do we read a zone when we have fuzzy zone edges? How did we read a zone diameter when we had hemolysis, beta hemolysis, and alpha hemolysis? And how do we deal with colonies within zones? And in this case, you can choose and focus on organisms and organism agents that are important to you. And at some step, we also think it's very good to train on some of the specific reading instructions that are very important. And you will know that from looking in the UCAS breakpoint table, because if the reading instructions is very important to get the correct results, they are also in the UCAS breakpoint tables. And there we have examples for Stenotrophomonas multifidia and trimethoprim-sulfametoxazole, where it's very important to know that if you see any kind of zone or clear, if the growth is cleared up, you should read that zone, even if it's not clear. For Staph aureus and benzyl penicillin, and for enterococci and vancomycin, you should read the zone diameter, but you should also look at the zone edge when you have a zone above a specific threshold. So those are also important to focus on, but I think that could be like a second step after you have trained a little bit on the more general instructions. When you do the practical reading exercise, we recommend, as I said before, that everyone reads zones from the same plate, but it's also good if you can have the same plate, this plate in a specific position. You should have the same lighting, the same background, the same caliper, so that everyone have the same, nothing has changed between the readers. They will use the same caliper, they will be in the same spot, they will have the same lighting. So that will not be factors that should affect the results. And we know from having performed reading exercises in many different ways, both in our own lab and also when we have had practical courses, that it is possible to standardize reading within ±1 millimeter among 15 to 20 people when you have a reading exercise like that. So that should be the aim, having a zone diameter within ±1 millimeter of each other. And then you have to decide how many isolates or strains should we have, how many antimicrobial agents, and that of course depends on the opportunities that you have. If it's a smaller group and more a research lab or a specialized laboratory, maybe you can add more isolates and more antibiotic agents. When we have performed reading exercises in our routine work, we have tried to limit it to 2 isolates. Those could be clinical isolates, but it could also be QC strains, and only 4 discs per plate, because we want it to go quite fast and go and read those zones. As I said before, the agents to select could be selected among the ones that are important, but of course, to make sense of a reading exercise, you should select both agents for which zones are easy to read and those that are difficult to read. So if we take Staph aureus as an example, cefoxitin is a very important disc. It's usually very easy to read with sharp zone edges. So that's a good example to have in there to see what happens when we read a zone diameter with very sharp and defined zone edges. And we would normally test clindamycin, erythromycin, and norfloxacin because those are a little bit more difficult to read and in different ways. So that's an example of where you can start to more look at standard reading instructions, fuzzy zone edges versus sharp zone edges. It's also possible to repeat it on 2 consecutive days, the same exercise, if you store the plates in the fridge in between. We have done that sometimes, and sometimes when people are out of work, for example, they can read on the 2nd day. But then we do 2 separate summaries, one for the 1st day, one for the 2nd day, because there might be maybe small differences that will affect the zone sizes. And now I will show you some examples from a reading exercise that we did quite many years ago in our laboratory when we were at the stage where we were going to implement the UCAS disk diffusion method. So that was just when the disk diffusion method has been published. And before that, we used another media, another inoculum. So it was a difference for everyone in the lab to learn how to work with the new UCAS disk diffusion method. So this is a Staph aureus strain. As you see, we have 6 different agents here that could have been limited to 4. That would have been enough. And each row here corresponds to one person. And of course, the person performing the reading exercise, or the one being an expert in disk diffusion in the laboratory, should also read the zone diameters. And I will show you an example of that later. Sometimes we have done, like, I have put my initials here because I would like to be, I can be open with, these are my results. But for everyone else, we have just numbered them 1 to 15, for example, and then when we discuss the reading exercise in the group, then they have their own number, so they know which number they are. So it's a little bit more anonymized, so that might be good. So this is then when we meet at the second occasion. So at the first occasion, we have the education, then we perform the reading exercise, then we analyze the data, gather the group again, and discuss the results. And as you can see here, I have calculated the mean value and the standard deviation. And when someone has read a zone that is more than 1 millimeter above the mean value, or more than 1 millimeter below the mean value, those are marked with colors here. And generally, it doesn't look so bad for cefoxitin. There are 2 people reading a little bit larger zones. For fusidic acid, we are actually very much in line and read more or less the same zone diameter. And it's just one that read a little bit smaller. But we started to look into, could we harmonize even further for some of these agents that are a little bit more difficult to read? And the first one we looked at was erythromycin, clindamycin, and fusidic acid, which usually have fuzzy zonages. So we went back to the reading guide, looked at the instructions, reminded everyone about holding the plate about 30 centimeters from the eye. And when you have a fuzzy zonage, you should more look at where is the zone diameter or my zone edge. You should not look at each and every stripe that might be a result of streaking the plate. So you more look at the whole picture and you estimate where your zone diameter is. You should never hold the plate up to light or use a magnifying glass if that's not specifically recommended. So usually the main problem when reading zones or organism-agent combinations where you have fuzzy zonages is that people will read them too small because they look too closely, and they look for, if you look at the second picture here, for example, you will look at each and every edge of this stripy pattern. And this is an example of a plate where we have actually taken care to streak the plate carefully, but you still see the patterns from streaking the plate. So that's more or less impossible not to do. But these examples could also have been much worse if plates weren't streaked that well. So that is could be discussed in the group. And then we actually, And then we looked at another example for norfloxacin, where we have most of the problems. You can also see that the standard deviation is higher here, it's 2 millimeters. And the ones reading smaller zones read 19 to 20. And then there are some people reading 25. So that is a 5 millimeter difference, which is not acceptable when we read zones from the same plate. So we looked specifically at Staph aureus and norfloxacin. There is almost always a double zone, an outer and an inner zone, and you should read that inner zone. So some people reading at 25 here, they ignored that growth and they read the outer zone, but that is not correct, not according to instructions. In this case, we actually have a quite clear end zone edge here. Sometimes that might also be a bit fuzzy. And then of course you go for the rule for fuzzy zone edges. You shouldn't look extremely close to find every edge from streaking the plate. So we actually after that repeated the reading exercise, which is of course the best way to do it. We couldn't use the same plates anymore. This was probably 2 weeks later, but we took the same isolate or strain, the same antibiotics, and now you can see that we were much more aligned, and that people now have read zone diameters that are very similar for norfloxacin, and the variation has also been reduced for the ones with the fuzzy zone edges. And here you can also see a very clear example for cefoxitin that we read zones very, very similar with the standard deviation only of 0.4 millimeters. So this is an example on how we performed the reading exercise. We analyzed the data, we discussed it in the whole group, reminded everyone on the reading instructions again, made it clearer. And then when we repeated the reading exercise, we had better results and we were more harmonized in reading zones. Another example is for Haemophilus influenza. And of course, if you test fastidious organisms, you should include some fastidious organisms. So maybe actually both Haemophilus influenza and Streptococcus pneumoniae are good examples. For Streptococcus pneumoniae, you will have the alpha hemolysis. Haemophilus influenza might be a bit difficult because you might have haze within zone and so on. So this is again then the same 15 people or something, maybe it's 12, and that read plates from the same. We have now 5 different antibiotics. And we can see that we have a little bit of different results this time. We have some difference here for tetracycline, but we also have more a pattern that one person reads zones smaller than the others, another one generally reads larger than the others. So that is when it's good to have only numbers here so that no one really feels that they are pointed at, but they can themselves take that feedback and go back and look at the plate again. So for Haemophilus influenza, we discussed that zone edges might be fuzzy or accompanied with haze. That again, it's important to hold the plate about 30 centimeters from the eye. We recommend to hold it at a 45-degree angle to the workbench, which usually helps quite a lot to get rid of that haze or very, very light fuzzy growth. We also discussed that can we enhance the appearance of the Haemophilus influenza disc diffusion plates, and we know that excess moisture in the media may cause fuzzy zone edges or haze within zones. So if you're not drying plates, maybe it's a good step to dry them and then repeat the reading exercise to see if that would make a difference. And it's never a disadvantage to dry the plate as long as you follow the drying instructions and do not dry them for several days, of course. And then we repeated the reading exercise for Haemophilus influenza. We still had some variations here for cefotaxime, but overall we had much better results and we were much more in line when reading the zones. So those were 2 examples, a Staph aureus example, a Haemophilus influenza example, where we are looking at the more general reading instructions. We did not have an example here with colonies within zones, but that's a good alternative also. If you have an E. coli with an ESBL, for example, and that strain has colonies within the cefotaxime or ceftazidime zone, that's also a good example to remind people that those colonies should be taken into account and not ignored when reading zones. Another example is from a reading exercise where we looked at one of those specific reading instructions and we focused on enterococci and vancomycin. And in this case, you should, and this is our routine, you should record the zone diameter, you read your zone. And if the zone is more than or equal to 12 millimeters, that is the susceptible break point, then you have to examine the zone edge. And in this case, we recommend that you hold the plate up to the light, but because it's much easier to define if the zone edge is sharp or fuzzy if you hold the plate up to light. But this is after having reading the zone diameter, which you do in the standardized way. This is also from the reading guide, where we explain this, that if your zone is more than or equal to 12 millimeters, if it's below 12 millimeters, it doesn't really matter if your zone diameter is fuzzy or sharp, because it should be reported resistant anyway. But if it's more than or equal to 12 millimeter, then you have to look at the zone edge. If it's sharp, like in this case, then you can report susceptible and you don't have to do anything else. If it is fuzzy, if you have colonies growing within the zone or close to the zone edge, Or actually, if you are uncertain, then you should suspect a VRE and perform confirmatory testing. So you could actually either report it resistant, or if it's your routine to perform a PCR to look for VAN genes, that's what you should do. And for this particular test, we also recommend that you incubate your plates for 24 hours before reading. And the reason for that is that after a longer incubation, 24 hours, instead of the standard 16 to 20 hours, it's easier to differentiate between the sharp and fuzzy zonage. And here we again have an example of where it's very, very important to streak the plates carefully. If you have gaps between streaks or patterns from streaking the plate, or if the growth is too light, it is usually very difficult to decide if you have a fuzzy or a sharp zonage. So that happens from time to time for us in the EDL, when people in the routine work stops by with a plate with an enterococci and vancomycin, and they say, should you regard this zone as fuzzy or sharp? And we would say, actually, we cannot say, because the light is too growth or the plate is too stripy. So we recommend that you just repeat the test until tomorrow, streak your plates very carefully, and then we will look at the zone again. One important thing here to define a sharp zone is that if you look at the first picture here, that it's almost getting a little bit whiter at the zonage. So that's also a sign of that you have that sharp zonage. But you should remember, as we say here, if you are uncertain, then it's better to treat it as a fuzzy zonage. And in this case, we had many different participants. We have the numbered ones here, 1 to 23. And then we actually decided that the people working in the EDL at that time, I am EM, Erika Maciek, and then 3 others, we decided to have our names here so that people could refer to our results. And the other ones were just numbered. So there were 23 other people in our lab reading. And we had maybe 8 isolates or something, so I will only show you results for 2 of them. Here is one isolate number 5, where you can see that we have read, some people have actually read definitely smaller zonages than what we did. We had 16 to 17 millimeters, and maybe actually that's because of the zone colonies here, which might appear more. Those plates were left in room temperature during the day, so maybe those colonies weren't that clear in the morning. But everyone read a zone diameter that was 12 millimeters or more, so that's above the susceptible breakpoint. And then we have to investigate the zonage. And it is, as I said, much easier when you hold the plate up to light. But also by looking at this one, you can see that this is probably a fuzzy zonage and not a sharp one. And it was only 3 persons here that reported it as sharp. In the second example, this zone had about the same zone size, but we are more similar in reading the zone size here. As you see, we didn't have those colonies within the zone, and we have this whitish end at the zone edge, which is also becomes much clearer when you hold the plate up to the light. So here we had 3 that said fuzzy. Those are not the same 3 people that said sharp in the previous example, but that is less important if you're going to do a confirmatory test with PCR. If it's negative for VAN genes, then you would still report it as susceptible. So that was just an example of how you can work with these specific reading instructions. But I definitely recommend that you start with more general reading instructions and maybe repeat it a couple of times. That could be up to you, of course. Is it better to test more isolates at the same time to be able to discuss them and everything, and then repeat a reading exercise for the same isolates? Or is it better to have a number of different reading exercises just to make it easier for people to do it in a very short time? But I think having a reading exercise, analyzing the data, discussing the data, and then repeating it again is a very good idea. In this case, with the enterococci and vancomycin, we had the reading exercise on one day for a Thursday, for example, and then on the Friday, we looked at the example, of the results and discussed it with everyone. And then we had all the plates stored. So after our discussion, everyone could go back in the lab and look at the plates again. So that's also, if it's possible, that's also a very good way to do it, to keep the plates so that people can go back and reread after a discussion, or look at the fuzzy or sharp zonage and see if they understand and agree that this is how to read this zone. So those were my examples for disk diffusion, and I have some examples for broth microdilution also, and some more conclusions in the end. So the rest is a shorter session. So I think we can start by asking if anyone has questions, any questions now. There is a question in the chat. Where do you keep the plates after reading? Yes, we would keep them in the fridge, because that would, then we have a better, it's more likely that we do not get any differences between the two test dates, or if you are going to look at the plates the day after again. So storing them in room temperature, then there is a big risk that things will start to happen, that zones will getting smaller because your organism is growing, that you will get colonies within zones that weren't there the day before. So, but if you store them in the fridge, you usually have more or less the same results the day after. Any other questions? Is there anyone who has experience of having performing a reading exercise?
Yes, Erica, I tried this in our lab, and we had issues with the fuzzy and sharp zone. Like,
or you had issues with
the fuzzy and sharp zone.
Mm-hmm.
You realize that a participant cannot easily see how or tell that a zone is fuzzy. So differentiating between the sharp and fuzzy zones was quite a challenge.
For enterococci.
Yes.
That
and,
is
and Staph aureus, sorry.
Yeah, and benzyl penicillin. That is a bit of a difficult test. But I do think that if you, of course, then you have to feel confident yourself that you know this is the correct way and this is the correct result, and then you should have the reference result somehow. And in these cases, it's probably a molecular test, both for the beta-lactamase in Staph aureus and for vancomycin resistance in enterococci. And that's mainly VAN-B mediated resistance. Most of the VAN-A mediated resistance will have no zones at all, so that's not difficult. So I think before you first of all have to practice yourself and feel confident that you know. And in some cases, it is very difficult. And maybe then the conclusion is that we are uncertain, and then the results are, then you should treat it as a possible resistant isolate if you are uncertain. For the Staph aureus and benzyl penicillin, we have learned that we think it's easier if you don't really think about it as fuzzy and sharp. For enterococci and vancomycin, I think the words fuzzy and sharp works pretty well with how it looks. But for Staph aureus and benzyl penicillin, we have changed the wording a little bit in the breakpoint table and in the reading guide and in the disk diffusion manual, to actually look at if the growth is decreasing up to the zone edge or not. So it's better not to look exactly at the zone edge. You look a little bit further outside the zone edge. So if you have a sharp, it should be like, it's called like a cliff. Then there is no reduction of growth. You have the same growth all the way up to the zone edge, and then it just stops. Then you have a sharp zone edge. If you see something that it changes, so you look beyond your zone edge a little bit further out in your inoculum or your growth, and then you look towards the zone edge, and if you hold it up to the light, and maybe actually you can stand a little bit on the side of the plate, that might make it easier, or we think it's easier, because sometimes when the people holding up the plate say it's difficult, and then another one stands next to that people reading saying, I can see it from here quite well. So you can test that too, to stand a little bit next to the plate. And then usually you can see, do we have the same growth, no reduction up to the zone edge, then it's sharp. But if you see any kind of reduction up to the zone edge, then it's fuzzy. So for me, that helps a lot when I read Staph aureus and benzyl penicillin, looking a little bit outside the zone edge to see, can I see anything change here in the growth? Does it reduce, or is it reduced, or is it the same all the way up to the zone edge? So those are some tips, and also for both those examples, it's very, very important to streak plates carefully, to have a confluent growth and evenly spread over the plate. Otherwise, it's very difficult to see the difference. But those are two difficult tests, and you probably, everyone needs to practice on them, both in the reference lab and in the routine lab.
Okay, thanks. And for norfloxacin, why are we reading the inner zone? Is it because it's bactericidal?
Yeah, actually for disc diffusion, we don't have a difference in how to read bactericidal or bacteriostatic antibiotics. So you should read them all the same. So norfloxacin, as you said, is a bactericidal. It should be killing the bacteria, not only reducing the growth. But for example, if you look at erythromycin, clindamycin, those are bacteriostatic, but you should still read all growth. So the UCAS standard instructions is to take what you see into account. The only agent where we have a different reading instruction is for trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, where we say that you can, first of all, have a very thin, hazy growth all the way up to the disc. Usually, if you have a clear outer zone, you should read that outer zone. And then you know that we have specific reading instructions for trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole for specific organisms, such as Stenotrophomonas multifida, but also for Achromobacter and Aromonas, for example, where we know that you should ignore growth within the zone, even if it's more than light haze. But otherwise, you read agents, regardless of if they are bacteriostatic or bactericidal, the same way in the UCAS method. And a fuzzy zone edge does not correlate to having a bactericidal or bacteriostatic agent. You could think otherwise. That would have been nice if you get sharp zone edges for the bactericidal drugs, but we don't see that. So we don't know exactly why do we get a sharp zone edge for gentamicin, but a fuzzy one for ciprofloxacin. So it's probably related to how the antibiotic diffuse in the agar, maybe how the molecule is, the structure of the molecule, and how the bacteria grow in the meantime, and components in the Miller-Hinton media that would affect how the zone edge appears. But for broth microdilution, we have a general difference between how you read bacteriostatic and bactericidal agents.
Great, thanks, Erika. I don't know if any other person has a question from the participants. Seemingly, there's no question from the other members.
Yes, then you can decide if we are going to take a break or if we should just continue with the rest of the presentation. But now is the best time for a break if we're having a break.
Yeah, let's take a 5 minutes break and then we resume at 10 minutes to 1.
Yes, okay, see you soon. Yes. I will share my screen again. So now we will look into some things to think about and examples for reading exercises for broth microdilution, which is of course also very important. If you are going to use broth microdilution, it's usually because you want to have a reference method. And then it's of course very important that you perform it correctly. And we have discussed that previously in previous presentations also, that broth microdilution is our reference method for antimicrobial susceptibility testing. But it's not a magical method where you always get the correct results. You have to follow the methodology, and that includes the reading instructions. A difference here is that there is no UCAST manual for broth microdilution. We refer to the ISO standard 20776-1 that can be purchased from ISO. We have some information in the UCAST breakpoint tables at the top of each table, but for reading of broth microdilution MIC endpoints, there is very little guidance in the ISO standard. The main reason for that is that it might change over time, and when new agents are added, they will not be part of that printed document until it gets updated 10 years later. So in the ISO standard, it's referred to CLSI document or UCAST documents for how to read broth microdilution endpoints. And we have a specific reading guide for that. And it's available also on the UCAST website if you go to AST of bacteria and MIC determination. And it's similar to the one we have for disk diffusion, that we start with more general instructions and recommendations, and then we have the more specific ones that are related to a specific agent or a specific organism or organism agent combination. So as for reading exercises for disk diffusion, we recommend that you include both agents that are difficult to read and those that are easy to read. Things that is usually problematic with reading broth microdilution endpoints, it might be related to hemolysis, where it might be difficult to see the difference between hemolysis and growth, and also trailing endpoints. But as with disk diffusion, you will have some agent organisms combination that are very easy to read with sharp and clear endpoints. For a broth microdilution, I think you should definitely focus on agents with specific reading instructions. Those are not that many as with disk diffusion. There is a general specific reading instruction that applies to all bacteriostatic agents. And then there is a specific reading instruction that applies to trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, and also trimethoprim only. And that is for all organisms tested. So those are very important to include and to practice on. And this is an example from the broth microdilution reading guide, where we have tried to explain how you should do when you read isolates for which you have hemolysis. You can look at the hemolysis when it stops. It usually helps. And as you can see in the first example here, you have a darker browner or greener color here, and then a more bright red color when you don't have any growth or any hemolysis. In this row here, or this well here, you can see that you have that browner color, but you could also see that it's still, you have turbidity. It's not clear. And that is the most important thing here. If you have turbidity in the well, or you have a pellet, then it should be regarded as growth. So you should actually look at growth, but I would still say that it usually helps to look at where the hemolysis stops also. And it is similar to what you see on MHF agar. If you have Streptococcus pneumonia or virulence group streptococci with alpha hemolysis, you will almost always see that if you have hemolysis, you also have growth in that well, even if it's not a defined pellet. For beta hemolytic strains, it might be that you have a well that is very clear, you had hemolysis in it. If it's clear, you should not take it into account. So you should look for growth, and it might be as a turbidity, and it might be as a pellet. And for bacteriostatic agents, here is an example of gram-positive cocci, but it also applies to gram-negative bacteria. But we more seldom test bacteriostatic agents for gram-negative bacteria. Examples are tigecycline, that could be tested on Enterobacterales, actually also Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter, and also tetracycline and doxycycline for Haemophilus influenza or Pasteurella moraxella. So there are a few bacteriostatic agents that we actually test gram-negative bacteria 4, and then the same reading instructions apply. For these, you might have trailing growth. So if you look at the last example here, which is linazolid, you can see that first you have quite heavy growth in your first well, and then it gradually decreases. And then we are looking for the point where you have a very tiny button of growth. And in this case, I think you have to consult the pictures in the reading guide because it is difficult to describe in words. So we have 3 examples here. 2 are for doxycycline. The first one is not that difficult because you have quite heavy growth and then you have a very, very tiny button. Yes, we should ignore that one. The other one is more gradually decreasing, and then we would say what you see here in the next last well, that is too much to ignore. That is not a pinpoint growth, and you should read it at the next level. But for the last example here, linazolid, and it's very important to read linazolid MICs like this, then you should ignore that tiny button of growth. So the best option here is to look at the reading guide examples, look at your QC strain, and use your QC strain as your reference to see that you get the correct MIC. I also mentioned that there is specific reading instruction for trimethoprim and trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, and that applies to all organisms tested. And here you should ignore a little bit more growth than what you do for the other bacteriostatic agents. And the recommendation is to read the MIC at the lowest concentration that inhibits at least 80% of the growth as compared to the growth control. So in this case, it's very important to always compare your growth to the growth control. We have the first example here where you can see that we have a very drastic decrease here, and we will say, yes, at least 80% is inhibited, and this is how we would read. There is also a very, very tiny pellet in the next well, but we would definitely read the MIC here. The same for the second row here. When we come to the last well with the pellet, we regard it as, yes, we have a reduction of at least 80%, so this is how we would read it. You can also in real life see a difference of the density of the pellet, that it gets less dense also when it reduces. On the third example here, we actually will read the MIC already in the first well, so it will be less than or equal to the lowest concentration on the panel. And then you can see that we have some trailing going on here, but also already in the first well, we have a very marked reduction, and that's where we will read the MIC. And in the last row, it's again a little bit more difficult with the MIC gradually decreasing, but you can see that we have a more drastic decrease between these 2 wells. I hope you see my pointer here, the one where we read and the one before that, but we still have some trailing going on here. And again, it's very important to look at the positive growth control. And then we can see, yes, we have a marked reduction here, and that is more than 80%. So those are 2 examples that I definitely think that you should include in your tests. Here we have a plate. It's a plate that we have tested. It has several different antibiotics on it, and it's difficult to see now because you cannot see how they are. If they are in rows or columns, they can be in all different directions here. But I have marked the one that is linazolid. It's here. It starts in B4 and goes all the way down to G4. We have the positive control, which we always should check, of course. Yes, we have a good growth in the positive control. This is linazolid and a gram-positive, I think it's a Staph aureus. So for linazolid, we should ignore pinpoint colonies, very tiny buttons of growth, and then we would read the MIC C4. Another example, again, the same plate. We have linazolid in the same position here, and we have quite much, is a significantly bigger pellet. So in this case, we would read in D4. Take that into account, and not as in our previous example where we had much, much less growth, and ignore that. So those are 2 good examples that can be used to practice reading for linazolid. Here is an example for trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, and it's on row F from F1 to F12. So in this case, we only have growth in the 2 first wells, and then we have to decide where shall we read our MIC. And then we have this 80% rule. And when we look at the positive control, it's not that big. So I would not ignore what is growth in F1, but I would ignore in F2, based on how the positive control looks and how much the growth has reduced compared to the positive control. Another example, trimethoprim sulfametoxazole still on the F row. And in this case, you can see that we have much more heavy growth in the positive growth control and also in the first wells here. And here I would read here as 80% inhibition. But if you use a plate like this, then you, as you see, you will have also other antimicrobial agents. The one in B here, I cannot say, I don't know which one it is, but as it is read, it's read like a bactericidal agent where you take everything into account for a bacteriostatic. I would have read it here in B2. So if for a broth microdilution plate, you will usually have different antibiotics on the plate, and then it might be sufficient to read one plate, maybe 2 plates, depending on what you want to achieve. And you might have to look into clinical isolates if your QC strains are not good examples. But of course, if QC strains are good examples and they show what you want to show, then you can just as well use the QC strains. We touched a little bit on this when Lynette asked a question after the reading. We talked about reading exercises for discrimination. And of course, it is a bit difficult to say what is then the correct result. But first of all, the one performing the reading exercise should be more well educated within the method than the rest of the lab. So usually I would suppose that you are the ones in your laboratories that are responsible for AST or responsible for educating others. And then it is you that have to decide what is the correct way to read this zone diameter. And it might be difficult. But first of all, we recommend to calibrate your own reading for QC strains against the ranges and target values in the QC table. It can help if you're looking at Staph aureus and erythromycin for broth microdilution. That is a bacteriostatic agent. You should ignore that pinpoint growth. Then you read. If you ignore it, will you get an MIC that are within the QC range? If you ignore it and you are below the QC range, maybe that's a sign that you are ignoring too much. If you are not ignoring it and you are at the upper limit or outside above the QC range, that might be a sign that you are should ignore the growth. So that could be some help. You cannot use it, of course, as a total. You cannot say that's always the case. If you get the wrong MIC, you have read it wrong. That's not what I'm saying. But when you are unsecure, you can have some help that you actually know the expected results for this strain agent combination is 0.25, for example. You can also, when you do your reading exercises, use decoded QC strains. If a QC strain works fine and shows what you want to show, then it's actually quite good to have a QC strain, because then you can compare the results to the QC ranges as well. We also recommend that you look into our documents, go back and look at the reading guide instructions, have the pictures on the computer next to you when you're reading the zones. That I think is very helpful for the enterococci and vancomycin, for example. Also with the broth microdilution reading guide, we have some printed copies or some pages that we think are more important in our lab. So when we are reading some agents, when we are reading linezolid, we haven't talked about sulfhydrocol today, which also it's a bit tricky because it's tricky both to test, you need a specific medium, and also to read. We always have those printed reading instructions next to us because it is difficult to read them. And then you are always welcome to contact us, to send us pictures, to discuss, to get hopefully some good advice or some feedback on what you can do. You can also think about it is important to decide how often or when and how often shall we perform a reading exercise. I would say it should always be a part of when you implement the UCAST distribution method. If you change from CLSI to UCAST or from another method to UCAST, or whenever it's a new method, we recommend that you include reading exercises as part of the implementation of the method. Also, after, as in our lab, when we have used the cost distribution method for many years, for 15 years almost, then we still have to do it when we introduce a new organism. For example, we started testing distribution of anaerobic bacteria last year, and there are specific reading instructions and important information on how to hold the plate and how to read zones. So then we performed a reading exercise for some selected anaerobic bacteria before we implemented the method in the routine work. And also, if you are adding an agent which is difficult to read for broth microdeletion, that could be either linezolid or trimethoprim sulfomethoxazole, then we also recommend that you organize reading exercises and train in how to read zones. And overall, for your routine method, we try in our lab to have some kind of reading exercise at least once a year. It could be relating to the, last year it was the anaerobes. Before that, I think we looked at carbapenemase producing Enterobacterales, that we read them correctly. We have looked at Enterococci and vancomycin, and we have also had these more general reading instructions, which is very good to repeat every now and then. How to read a fuzzy zonage, how to read Streptococcus pneumoniae when you have hemolysis, etc., etc. So there is no official guidance or advice on this, but it is good to repeat it with some kind of interval, and maybe once a year is a good interval. If you have a lot of new staff, it might be better to do it more often, twice a year or even more often, to make sure that everyone reads zones as similar as possible, or MI6. So that was my last slide. So you're welcome to ask questions, both on specifically on broth microdilution or in general on reading exercises or anything that could relate to this issue.
Erika, I have a question on manual inoculation of MH for gram-positive.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is not using the rotator, so if with the rotator we do like 4 times,
Mm-hmm.
but then how do you now inoculate gram-positives, for example, Staph aureus manually?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think actually my point is that either if you use a plate rotator or if you inoculate the plates manually, you will have to practice and learn your technique how to inoculate the plates. You always use a rotator, so I'm not that good at manual inoculation, but the main rule is that you should spread your inoculum in 3 directions to cover the whole plate. So I mean, the aim, I think you have the same aim regardless of how you inoculate your plates. So the aim is to get a confluent growth which is evenly spread over the agar surface. And we also know that there might be differences between cotton swabs from different manufacturers that might result in that you have to inoculate your plates a little bit differently. So you have to practice with the materials that you have, the agar and the cotton swabs that you have. But of course, the same rule applies that you should not remove excess fluid. You should have a very wet cotton swab. And then you will have to practice on how many times do I have to turn my plates? How shall I streak to get an even and confluent growth? So there is no really 100% recommendation for how to do that. I would say that in my experience, unless maybe some people are very, very experienced in streaking plates by hand and they get a very nice results. But if you use a plate rotator, it's easier to keep your cotton swab a little bit lighter on the agar surface. That's also important, regardless of which method you use, that you don't push your agar, your cotton swab into the agar, because you want to avoid making marks in the agar as much as possible. So I would say that there is one risk with spricking plates manually, that there is a bigger risk that you actually push your cotton swab more into the agar and get marks from spricking the plates. But I think that some people that have spricked plate manually their whole life, they are very good at it and will get as good results as when you use a rotator. We know that there are problems with the rotators as well. For example, if you move your cotton swab too fast, you will not cover the whole area and you will have gaps between the streaks, but they will be circular instead of in a square pattern.
Okay, thanks, Erika, because I noted when we hosted the ICAS workshop last year, most of the participants in their labs, they do not have the rotator. They do the inoculation manually. So that's why I asked the question. Thank you.
Yeah. Which is okay, but then you have to practice on that method to get the end result, which is a confluent and evenly spread inoculum.
So, thank you. Any other question from the online participants? I can see Tata and Medea from Georgia. I'm not sure if they have questions.
No questions. Hi, Lynette.
Hi, Tata.
Yeah, of course. And if you are trying to, I think, Lynette, you and Honor, you did have a reading exercise when you had a workshop in Kenya last autumn. And if any of you is planning to set up a reading exercise, you're of course always welcome to contact us if you would like to have some thoughts or advice on that.
Yeah, sure. We're planning to have additional reading exercises with the workshop that we're holding in April. Yeah, so we'll reach out.
Good. I could also summarize and say that one reason why we in UCAST is we try to be very clear about the importance of reading zones in the correct way is that we try to standardize everything as much as we can with the disc diffusion test and the broth microregulation test. But reading of zones is the part that is most difficult to standardize. And we think that this is one way to harmonize reading and to standardize reading more. And actually, I think that CLSI is more and more thinking in the same way also, and they have also expanded on reading guides. And they are also working against trying to harmonize reading and be very clear about this is how you should read a zone that looks this way.
Okay, thanks. And then on reading the zones, so there are labs that use calipers, others use rulers. Are there chances that there could be differences? Because I realized when I was using rulers to measure the zones, most of the results were odd numbers. But then now for the caliper, there are some that are even numbers, others are odd. So I don't know the comment that you can give on the differences.
Yeah, I would say that we think that a caliper is definitely better if you can choose that. We buy our calipers from the construction industry because they are in lightweight plastic and easy to use. They're just manual, simple calipers, but they work fine for what we need them to. We don't have, I mean, in the UCAST distribution manual, we say that you can use a ruler, so it's not forbidden, but I would say it's easier to read with a caliper. But again, that might also depend on experience. If you have several years of experience of reading with a ruler, that might be just as good actually. But I agree with you, a caliper is usually more exact, and I would personally say that I would always prefer a caliper before a ruler.
Sorry, and how is the caliper calibrated? Like, should you calibrate the caliper as well every few months or something?
That's a very good question, and we have discussed it in our own routine lab as part of our accreditation, because we calibrate scales and everything and incubators. Actually, it's quite difficult to calibrate a caliper. Then you would probably need a piece of something that will never change size, and you would know that this should always be 20 millimeters or 10 millimeters when I read it, and we don't have, I am not aware of any such materials. But what we recommend is that you check, we check every day actually, when you put it into the innermost position, that it shows that is 0, that now it's 0. I'm not measuring anything, it's just closed, then it should be 0. If it's not, you can actually, on those manual calipers, change that reader a little bit so that it actually shows 0 when you are in the innermost position. So that's the only advice that we have. But I agree, it's a good question. On the other hand, of course, when it comes to reading of zones, we are not interested in decimal points. So if it's 21.5 or 22, that doesn't really matter. So we also have to accept that we are not in an area which is that precise as weighing compounds for making antibiotic solutions, for example. But of course, we should make sure that they don't show any value when they are in the innermost position. And if we doubt them, I think it's good to compare with another caliper that you have in your lab and to change the ones that you don't feel comfortable with.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, any other person with a question? Like the other people have so quiet. Erica, I think that marks the end of today's presentation, meaning that there are no additional questions from the participants. I think we can end here. It's 1:18.
Yes, so thank you, everyone. Did you record as well?
Yes, I did.
So you can tell me, I think when I stop this meeting, my recordings will be transferred to my computer. So
Yes.
if you need them, just let me know.
Okay, I will. Then you also remember to share today's presentation.
Yes, I will send it to Arshni.
Nice. So just a reminder to the participants, we upload the videos and the PowerPoint presentations in the CGIAR AMR website. So you are free to check and also share with your colleagues. That's all, and bye guys. Until next time, Erica.
Thank you. Have a good